Thank you very much for your attendance. I'm Philip Lipsey, and I direct the Center for the Study of Global Japan at the University of Toronto. Welcome to today's event on Japan and Asia in the pandemic era, focusing on the impact of the recently signed Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP, agreement, a major economic agreement that encompasses about a third of the world's population and GDP. I would like to acknowledge and thank our co-sponsors, the Center for Japanese Research at the University of British Columbia and the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada, and we look forward to collaborating on many future events as well. Before we begin, I would like to deliver a land acknowledgement. We wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I would also like to thank Mio Otsuka, our events and program coordinator, as well as the staff at the Monk School for their support of this event. Following the panel presentations, we will have a Q&A session. Please use the built-in Q&A feature on Zoom, or if that's not working, email csgj.monk@utoronto.ca to submit your questions. Feel free to submit questions during or after the presentations. I would like to now pass the baton over to Ambassador Deanna Horton, a senior fellow at our center. Prior to assuming her current position, Ambassador Horton was a distinguished Canadian Foreign Service officer whose illustrious career included over 12 years in Tokyo, negotiator on the North American Free Trade Agreement, and Canadian ambassador to Vietnam, among many other illustrious appointments. Ambassador Horton will introduce the panel and moderate the discussion. Without further ado, Ambassador Horton.
Thank you, Philip. Hello, everyone. I'm honored to be moderating this panel today. As Philip mentioned, I'm a senior fellow at the Monk School, but I'm also a distinguished fellow at the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. And I am very grateful to our co-sponsors at the Asia Pacific Foundation and to the Center for Japanese Research at the University of British Columbia, and to Philip Lipsey and Mio Otsuka at the Center for the Study of Global Japan, and everyone else at Monk School. Thank you very much for hosting us today. So happy New Year of the Ox to everyone, and good riddance to the year of the metal rat. The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, known as RCEP, after long years of negotiations, wrapped up last November at the virtual ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations Summit. It can truly be called a child of the pandemic. Many people were surprised that this agreement could have been completed, and even without India. In spite of the fact that this agreement covers 15 nations, representing more than 2 billion people and around 1/3 of the global economy, it did not garner much attention in Canada. But there are many unanswered questions, which I'm hoping our very distinguished panel will be able to answer. Does RCEP signal a new direction in Asia, particularly in terms of intra-Asian relationships in ASEAN? What role did Japan play? And is it a Chinese agreement? I am going to briefly introduce the members of the panel in the order in which they will be speaking. Their longer bios are available on the website. So first, Mike Plummer, who is the director of the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies Europe, my alma mater, and E&I professor of international economics. He is also a non-resident senior fellow at the East-West Center and has years of experience in academia and policy centered on Asia and economic cooperation. He is co-author or editor of over 24 books and author of over 100 journal articles and book chapters. Next, Shihoko Goto, who is Deputy Director for Geoeconomics and Senior Associate for Northeast Asia, the Asia Program at the Wilson Center in Washington. At the Wilson Center, Goto-san focuses on the economy and politics in Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea, as well as US policy in the region. She has a background in journalism, having spent 10 years reporting from Tokyo and Washington for Dow Jones and UPI on the global economy, international trade, and Asian markets and politics, and then as contributing editor to the Globalist and working for the World Bank. Next, Wendy Cutler is Vice President at the Asia Society Policy Institute and the Managing Director of ASPI's Washington, D.C. office. I have known Wendy for years, while serving both in Washington and in Tokyo, for her excellent work at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, USTR. As the acting deputy USTR, she worked on a range of U.S. trade negotiations and initiatives in Asia. Wendy is in big demand these days for webinars, as everyone is looking for guidance on the new Biden administration's strategy on Asia and on trade policy. Jeff Reeves is Vice President of Research for the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. Prior to joining APF Canada, Jeff was the Director of Asian Studies at the United States Army War College. Jeff has over 15 years direct experience living and working in Asia, including with the Daniel K. Inouye Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies, Griffith University in Australia, Peking University, and has worked with the United Nations Development Program and World Wildlife Foundation in Beijing, the London School of Economics and Political Sciences Asia Research Center, and with the Peace Corps in Mongolia. Yves Tiberghien is a professor of political science, director emeritus of the Institute of Asian Research, and co-director at the Center for Japanese Research at the University of British Columbia. He is also a distinguished fellow at the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. His current research focuses on the ongoing transition in the global economic and environmental order. His newest book, called Geopolitics in East Asia, Response to COVID-19, is coming out shortly. And he tells me that half of it is focused on increased regional cooperation, RCEP, Japan-China, and AIIB-ADB convergence. So, a reminder to participants, we welcome your questions. Please send them via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Now, I would like to turn it over to Mike Plummer.
Thanks very much, Dan. I've got a short PowerPoint that I would like to use. What I'd like to do in my few minutes is simply go over some of the economics of RCEP, or more generally Asia-Pacific cooperation, because I think that RCEP is best understood as a process of deepening policy integration within the Asia-Pacific region. And I'd like to share some results that from the work I've done with my co-author, Peter Petri, on estimating the effects of these various groupings. Now, very briefly, what is RCEP? Diana, you already mentioned some of it. It's supposed to be an ASEAN-centric free trade area that was signed in November, and it's been in negotiation since November 2012. The partners are the ASEAN countries, but also Northeast Asia, Japan, China, and South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and as Professor Horton mentioned, India dropped out last November for various reasons. This grouping has a lot of overlapping FTAs. In fact, to be a original negotiating member of RCEP, one had to have a bilateral free trade area with ASEAN. So it was already, you had a lot of FTAs that were going to build into the process. The value added of the agreement will be, first of all, free trade in Northeast Asia, because the one region that did not have free trade areas in place was Northeast Asia. There was a superficial agreement between South Korea and China, but this has a lot more teeth to it. It also would level out the noodle bowl of all these bilateral free trade areas, expanded market access in goods and some services. For example, tariffs are limited at 92% eventually over 20 years, 92% of goods compared to 96% in the CPTPP. also lowering NTBs. Services liberalization would take place both as positive and negative lists, but eventually supposed to go to negative lists on the longer term. Importantly, it has cumulative rules of origin, which is part of that leveling of the noodle bowl, because these rules of origin, which allow multinationals to rationalize their production efficiently through vertical integration, that's a big deal by having a cumulative rules of origin. And since the RCEP countries are deeply involved in supply chains, this was a big thing. Of course, there's nothing on sensitive areas like you see in the CPTPP, like on state-owned enterprises, on labor and the environment, and there's also no investment state dispute settlement mechanisms. A lot of the material in the agreement are just WTO consistent or WTO plus, for example, on IPR and on electronic transfers. If you want to look at the effects on the global economy, it's complicated to model them because the RCEP was just negotiated, but that's on top of a CPTPP agreement that had already been in effect since December of 2018. And then we've got this big trade war. And so in our modeling, we had to sort of put all of these things together and line them up in our estimates. We don't include estimates of the pandemic, however. Well, first of all, we look at the US-China trade war, which we estimate reduces global income by about $301 billion annually by 2030. And that is very significant, by the way, because this is an annual shock over time. The biggest losers, of course, are China, which is $304 billion, and the United States. Now, including the CPTPP partially offsets the effect of the trade war, and adding RCEP on this, which is almost double what the CPTPP would do, compensates completely for the trade war, but of course, China and the United States continue to lose. Adding additional members onto this configuration of deepening integration, and it actually dwarfs the trade war, and you get far deeper layers of integration. So looking at it visually, you'll see the trade war you've got here as being, minus 301. The CPTPP slightly compensates for it. RCEP brings it up to about the same level. If you do the CPTPP plus China, which President Xi said he'd be interested in possibly joining during his APEC speech in December, and if you include all the members that have said that they wanted to join the CPTPP, you get very, very large effects. So economic integration in the region is very important. The effects on trade policies generally are about twice as much as the income effects. But I want to underscore that the biggest effects are between China, Japan, and Korea. And if we look at this in the trade patterns, it's very clear that China, Japan, and Korean exports to China increased by $178 billion annually, and Japanese and Korean imports from China increased by $96 billion annually, by far the biggest effects that we see through the RCEP agreement. So just to conclude my opening remarks, how is the RCEP being viewed by the US and the EU? It doesn't surprise me that Deanna was saying that it didn't get a lot of press in Canada. I think it did get quite a bit of press in Washington and to some degree in Brussels, but it's been put on the back burner. People haven't been talking about it. In Brussels, the big news is the comprehensive agreement on investment with the EU, which is really arguably more strategic value for China than economic value for either China and the EU. Happy to talk about that further if anybody's interested. Still, it shows a desire for engagement on the part of the EU. As you probably know, the UK said it would like to apply to the CPTPP as part of its Global Britain program post-Brexit. For the US, and I'm sure we'll hear more from Wendy on this, the past 4 years did not see much US engagement on the economic front in the Asia Pacific. And in a competitive environment, China seems to be clearly outmaneuvering the United States in essentially every way, through the Belt and Road Initiative, through RCEP, and through this proposal perhaps to think about joining the CPTPP. And I think an important priority, in my view, for the Biden administration needs really to be re-engagement. And this could eventually be eventually joining the CPTPP after the midterm elections. But of course, Ambassador Cutler is more informed on that than I am. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Mike. Okay, over to you, Goto-san.
Hey, thank you so much. I want to spend my initial comments discussing the impact of RCEP on the power structure of Asia. Now, RCEP was initially dismissed as a lower standard, poor cousin to the TPP. And with the United States walking away from the TPP and never being part of RCEP, we've seen two mega deals, CPTPP, with the remaining TPP 11 member countries, as well as RCEP come into fruition. And we've seen a great shift in the power dynamics of the Indo-Pacific. And that really is a watershed moment in reimagining the regional order without the US. And so there are these disparate countries that are focused more on what binds them together, namely economic interests under a common rule structure. And this unites a region that continues to be the most dynamic and populous in the world. But amid that confidence and optimism about reimagining a regional order without the United States, there are dark clouds that are hanging overhead. Can shared economic interests and commitment to common trade rules actually overcome the growing political friction that can actually thwart economic cooperation? So in discussing this reimagined regional order, I want to focus particularly on the shift in expectations for Japan's role in regional leadership and Japan's rise to that occasion. Of course, Japan had been the last amongst the 12 TPP countries to join the agreement. And when he announced the decision that Japan would join, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who at the time was the prime minister, declared that Japan needed to join TPP to ensure not just economic growth, but to ensure that Japan remained a regional as well as global power. And it led Japan really to become not just a rule follower, but actually a rule maker in this trade framework. When the United States pulled out of the TPP, there was a great deal of anxiety in Tokyo about going against the United States. And there was a lot of anxiety about a potential backlash of Washington should Tokyo decide to move forward with the TPP. But once that initial concern was overcome, Japan actually was really at the forefront to make sure that CPTPP came into fruition. At the same time, over the last 4 years, we've seen Japan really take on this mantle of not simply being a rule follower, but a rule maker. It's had a bilateral with the European Union, as well as the United Kingdom. And it also concluded a bilateral trade agreement with the United States, which from Japan's perspective was most important for what it did not do, which is it did not hurt its critical auto industry. And it also was, of course, at the forefront of expanding CPTPP and being a key member of ensuring that RCEP came to a successful conclusion despite the pandemic as well. And these achievements really changed the narrative of Japan. It really promoted itself as a champion, not just of free trade, but a major supporter of the international liberal order. And it actually also coincided with a period of great political stability within Japan. And Shinzo Abe was really able to navigate the Trump administration much better than some of the other industrialized countries and the traditional allies of the United States. It ensured that Japan was able to ensure that the door remained open for the United States' return. And at the same time, it gave greater confidence to the Abe government in particular for Japan to play this role as a regional stabilizer rather than simply a caretaker in the absence of the United States. Now, as we look ahead, can we expect further Asian economic unity through a trade, through RCEP and CPTPP, or have we actually peaked? And I actually see three dark clouds looming. The first is the fact that the United States is still very much an unpredictable factor in all of this. The absence of Washington is expected to continue in the Asia Pacific, especially in establishing rules. There's clearly a lack of appetite in Washington for new trade deals. Although it must be said that the Biden administration itself is very much for the United States rejoining the TPP, at least in principle. Bear in mind that many of the principal actors that have been appointed to key economic posts, as well as on the foreign policy front, have really are seasoned veterans of the Obama administration. And it's particularly noteworthy that the NSC has created a new post specifically to focus on the Indo-Pacific with Kurt Campbell, who is the former Assistant Secretary of State of East Asia, really leading that, that wave. And he is expected to refocus on ensuring that the rebalance to Asia that had started under the Obama administration and for which TPP played such a tremendous role is actually carried forward. But again, there are domestic political as well as economic considerations to be considered in the United States. And the Biden rhetoric about working together with allies, working together on a multilateral front, wanting to push back against Chinese unfair practices with allies may not necessarily translate into action. And certainly within Asia, there's a lot of concern about the Biden administration's push to buy American. And there's a lot of concern too about no new trade deals emerging. For Asia, there is also a concern about a disconnect between how the United States sees the threat of China compared to how they see China. In Washington, the common narrative that does have bipartisan support is to see China as a strategic competitor. In Asia, the more common narrative is to figure out how to have selective cooperation with China. And it's within this prism of selective cooperation that RCEP is able to unite Southeast Asia as well as Japan, Korea, and New Zealand, as well as Australia. The second dark cloud that is looming is the fact that Japan, that has been so instrumental in bringing RCEP as well as CPTPP, particularly CPTPP to fruition, is that it is running out of steam in leadership. Abe had been at the forefront of actually pushing for this idea of an Indo-Pacific. It was actually he who had delivered a speech about the overlapping interests of the Indian and Pacific Oceans at a speech before the Indian Parliament in 2007. And he actually made a great effort to enhance the power of the Prime Minister's Office on Foreign Affairs, especially including trade, over his 8 years in power. The current administration under Prime Minister Suga is facing a lot of uncertainties, not least the fact that it is up for election by September of this year at the latest. It also has issues about dealing with the pandemic, also the very publicly sensitive issue of whether or not Japan can actually host the Summer Olympics this year or not. There's a decreased ability as a result for the Suga administration to pursue ambitious foreign policies, as well as to move forward with ambitious economic visions. And Suga himself is much more focused on domestic issues, including digital integration, and he is also, to give him fair credit, focused on issues like climate change. I should point out, though, that these two issues, although they are domestic challenges, ultimately they do have cross-border, trans-border interest as well. But it seems unlikely that Suga is going to be able to actually push Japan into the forefront of dealing with these issues. And be an international leader in dealing with these issues, which is really a missed opportunity for Japan. And because if there is an opportunity to have China focused on multilateralism and to focus on committing itself to the post-war rule of law framework, it is CPTPP. And the fact, as Michael said, the fact that Beijing is demonstrating interest in joining the framework is something that should be lauded, and it should have greater overtures from current members, particularly Japan, for China to join the framework. Japan really does have a unique role to play, not just because it is the third largest economic power and the single biggest power that is a member of both RCEP and CPTPP. It is because that Japan, not too long ago, faced many similar issues that China is facing now. Criticism about industrial policy, criticism about dumping, protectionism, that Japan had to ultimately overcome. And by overcoming those unfair trade practices, it actually led to greater structural reform within Japan, and it actually benefited by becoming more resilient, and it actually merged with companies that are truly much more competitive globally as a result. The third and final dark cloud that I want to mention for RCEP is that RCEP has actually not led to greater convergence in East Asia, most notably in Northeast Asia between Japan and Korea. Japan continues to have export restrictions on 3 critical components to manufacture semiconductors against South Korea, which were imposed in 2019. Lifting those restrictions were not part of the conditions to join RCEP. Likewise, Korea continues to demand that Japanese companies sell their assets to compensate for wartime labor and sexual abuse, and lifting those were not part of the RCEP negotiations or any barrier to entry either. So relations between Japan and Korea still remain thorny, and this really puts a damper on the idea that further economic integration could actually lead to greater political and diplomatic cooperation as well. So let me leave it out there.
Goto-san, that was a great tour d'horizon in Northeast Asia. Turning over to you, Wendy.
Well, thank you, Dan. It's really my pleasure to be here. When you called me up and invited me to this panel, I was thrilled to join you, having worked with you for so many years in different positions in our respective governments. And it's a thrill to join Michael Plummer and Goto-san and my other new friends on the panel. So I'm going to get back to the theme of RCEP, but I will just say that Goto-san raised so many issues that I could enter into a discussion on, but I'm going to put those aside and kind of put the focus back on RCEP. I think when you look at RCEP, there are basically two polarizing perspectives. One is that on one end of the spectrum, people look at this deal, they say it's weak, they say it's meaningless, it's a patchwork of just bringing existing agreements together, adding a few new rules, but basically it's not going to change the landscape of trade and investment in Asia. On the other side of the spectrum, there are people sounding alarm bells, saying that this is just another example of a mega trade deal where the United States is not participating, and therefore, we're losing out every day. Needless to say, I come out somewhere in between these two perspectives. So first, I would say, from my vantage point, I think it's fair to say that RCEP it's basically a low standard agreement, okay? When I read the text, particularly as a former trade negotiator, I look for certain things, and RCEP kind of checks some of these boxes, and that is, there's a pretty low level of tariff liberalization, particularly when compared to other trade agreements, and has many exclusions, particularly with respect to sensitive agricultural products. The phrase, there's a lot of wiggle room in the rules language of this agreement. When I see phrases like, here's the obligation, but you can fulfill it in accordance with your current laws and regulations. Deanna, you'll probably agree with me. That's always a buzzword of you can just do whatever you want. There are exceptions for developing countries. There's a lot of the language that you see that suggests not hard commitment, like shall endeavor to. That's basically you make your best efforts, but you're not obligated to do it. Many of the chapters are not enforceable. The dispute settlement provision does not apply to them. And then there are just long transition periods, both with respect to tariff liberalization, but also with respect to certain rules provisions. So with that in mind, I would just say, though, I can say all that, but at the same time, I think it is wrong to dismiss this agreement as irrelevant and meaningless. And why do I say that? 5 quick reasons. The first is this is a mega deal in Asia, and as explained by the previous speakers, it brings together 15 countries in Asia, different backgrounds, different levels of development, different historical encounters, and they all come together under the tent of RCEP. So I think that is pretty significant and should not be underestimated. Second, I think it demonstrates that countries in Asia are becoming more and more confident about negotiating agreements among themselves. They don't need the United States. And I think that as a result of this agreement, a lot of ministers spent a lot of time with their sleeves rolled up, working on this language. And those relationships will continue, particularly as ministers keep meeting to discuss ratification and implementation. Third, there are provisions in the deal itself that are meaningful. In particular, and Michael touched upon this, having an RCEP-wide rule of origin. So no longer will a product among these 15 countries be a Korean product or a Malaysian product. It will now be an RCEP product, and that will make it a lot easier for companies to move these products and to develop supply chains among these countries. Fourth, institutional mechanisms are created through this agreement, including the structure of committees and ministers meeting. There's a secretariat, and there's also discussion about not only when these ministers get together and assess implementation of the agreement and work through problems, but they can also talk about additional issues. And that gets to my last point, that in many respects, and I think Michael touched upon this, this is a living agreement. And for anyone who's worked on ASEAN agreements before, it's hard to judge them by just stage one. They build on these agreements over time, and I expect the same from RCEP. So who are the winners and losers from this agreement? I think the 15 members of RCEP are winners. Japan in particular, I think, is a big winner, and that's because Japan did not have free trade agreements with China nor Korea, and therefore has now, through this agreement, achieved access and also has rules of the road that can be enforced with respect to those other two countries. But clearly other countries in the region have benefit as well. And I think Michael's slides underscored some of those winners. Now, the two losers in particular are the United States as well as India. Now, India left this agreement in November 2019 after participating in the negotiations for 6 years. And I think why did India leave? I think for a number of reasons. There was domestic opposition to this agreement. They were worried that if they lowered their tariffs in particular, that would invite more imports from China. And they already had a pretty huge trade deficit with China. India seems to be going the other way. They're raising their tariffs, putting in more restrictions vis-a-vis rest of the world, which sets them on a different trajectory than certain other RCEP members. And my understanding is, among Indians who look at free trade agreements that they've entered into, they have concluded that they've lost from these agreements. Now, with respect to the United States, RCEP does pose a number of challenges, and I want to I know we're running short of time here, but I do want to check. I want to just briefly go through kind of 7 reasons why I think the U.S. loses here. And when I look through them, I think a number of these also pertain to India as well. First of all, RCEP comes on the heels of implementation of the CPTPP and other bilateral agreements in the region. So once again, the US is on the outside looking in. Second, the US will not obtain the market access benefits of the agreement. And even if some of the provisions of RCEP are applied on an MFN basis, the US will not be able to enforce their rights under this agreement, not being part of the agreement. Third, the US will not be part of these committees and ministers' meetings that I mentioned, and they're going to lose their seat at the table in terms of helping shape rules and the next stage of these negotiations. Fourth, as more economic integration occurs in Asia due to this agreement, the United States won't be part of that integration. And I think because of the rules of origin, we're going to see strengthened supply chains among the RCEP members. And once again, the US companies will, for the most part, not get the benefits of entering these supply chains. Next, the question is, do some of these RCEP rules spill over to the World Trade Organization to bridge gaps? And so some of these rules, I don't think if the United States were part of RCEP, they'd ever agree to them. And some of these rules I could see being offered by certain RCEP members in WTO negotiations as potential ways to bridge the gap. 6, we're going to see more and more diversification in Asia with its trading partners, which I think will continue the trend of Asian countries trading less and less with the United States and more among themselves, which means the US over time is just losing its leverage in negotiations. Our market is not as attractive and central as it used to be. And finally, and I think what we're seeing here is just a China that's becoming more and more confident. After signing RCEP, it quickly then sealed the deal with Europe on this comprehensive agreement on investment. It also updated its FTA negotiations with New Zealand to update their existing free trade agreement. And China's already talking about reinvigorating the FTA negotiations between Japan, Korea, and China, the trilateral negotiations. And finally, as Michael said, China is putting down its markers with respect to its interest in joining CPTPP. So with that, I'm going to conclude and turn it over to the next speaker.
Thank you, Wendy. Great view from Washington. And now I'm going to turn over to Jeff for the view from Vancouver.
Thanks, Deanna. I'm not sure what I can say to add to some of the excellent comments that have come beforehand, but I'll certainly try to provide at least some value add from my perspective. Really what I'd like to do is try to maybe move a little bit away from the political economics of RCEP, which I think have been covered really well, and talk a little bit more about it in terms of its kind of strategic implications, in particular with respect to the emerging idea of an Indo-Pacific, and in particular a US-led kind of free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, which in the last couple of days we've seen the Biden administration line up behind, in particular with the call between Biden and Xi Jinping a few days ago, where the free and open Indo-Pacific was once again referenced as kind of the key US approach to the region. And as Goda-san said earlier, this is also an organizing approach for Japan, increasingly for Australia. Other European states are lining up behind it. And as we think about the Indo-Pacific, how does RCEP fit into this? For me, the place to start in this discussion is really to look at the Indo-Pacific concept itself, which has become, I think, really so ingrained in our contemporary strategic discourse around Asia that we forget that the concept is actually relatively new, at least in its broader application, and that it has certain inherent assumptions built into it that aren't entirely uncontroversial. Now, I don't mean to go into the concept's history here, if only to say that it first came into widespread usage around 2017 and 2018, with its replacement of the Asia Pacific as a geographic concept in the 2017 US national security concept, and the 2018 US Combatant Command PACOM rechanging its name to Indo-PACOM. Now, I think it's uncontroversial to say that other states like Australia and Japan have been representing the concept either with respect to the natural confluence between seas or the Indo-Pacific as a geographic area going back into 2006, 2007. And many of these ideas actually informed US strategic thinking about the subject as a result. But I really do think that it was only after the US started using it in its own strategic analysis and planning that it caught on throughout the region and indeed became a concept that European states started to integrate with their thinking about Asia. And I think you can clearly see this throughout regional statements and leadership statements and policy statements coming from the Asia Pacific since around 2017. So there are two things to note here. One is that the Indo-Pacific has both operational and normative aspects. Operationally, it describes a region stretching across the Pacific and the Indian Ocean areas that includes India and sometimes Africa and the Middle East into a greater Asian region. Now, normatively, it relies on concepts like free and open and the liberal rules-based order to describe its proponent states' governance and economic policies, both aligned with liberalism, democracy, and free markets. That's my baseline. So where does RCEP's inception or its conceptual inception and adoption fit into this, and what does it mean for the region? So first, I think RCEP challenges the very idea that the Indo-Pacific makes sense as an economic region outside of energy trade, which does indeed draw, I think, East Asia, the Middle East, and North America, or North Africa in particular, into kind of a trade-focused loop, and to the extent that it provides a logic for further integration. Now, together with the CPTPP, increased regionally based investment in capital and the growing relevance of an ASEAN economic community tied with East Asia through the ASEAN +3 mechanism, RCEP provides further evidence that Asia is becoming more increasingly regional and indeed less dependent on external sources for things like capital and consumer goods than it was before. Now, this isn't particularly an insight. I think the previous speakers have mentioned that this is a particular Asian-focused agreement. Economists like Danny Quah have been describing this movement of the global center of economic gravity coming into East Asia for decades, or for about a decade. But the RCEP's adoption within Asia is clear evidence that consolidation is far from over and may actually just be picking up pace. Right. So second, RCEP's inclusion of China lays rest, or at least challenges, the largely US-based idea that Asian small and middle powers see China as a regional threat in need of balancing, or a threat to stability, again, here defined in economic terms. I think what we saw with RCEP is that when asked whether they wanted more or less China, 14 Asia Pacific economies lined up and uniformly said they'd like more. They want engage with China rather than to balance against it. Now, we can talk about that in broader kind of military or strategic terms, but in this particular instance, there was a great embrace, I think, of China as an important regional actor, and that's something that has large strategic implications for the US engagement in the region and other Western powers as well, which I'll get to in just a second. So this even includes states like Australia that are currently experiencing obviously serious kind of political economic issues with China, but whose strategists I do think understand the long-term importance of China as a trade and investment partner within the Asia Pacific. Third, and kind of a corollary to this further point, is the fact that Asia is moving forward without the United States, and that the US unwillingness to enter into large multilateral trade agreements has not hindered Asia-Pacific developments around trade and multilateralism. We saw this with the CPTPP, and we're seeing it with RCEP. Now, it's worth noting here, as some of the other speakers have already raised, that while the Biden administrations may find ways to engage with Asia around specific issue areas or within specific sectors, it will always be strategically disadvantaged as long as it's unable to demonstrate economic resolve in the region through some sort of multilateral forum, right? Efforts under the Trump administration around the Blue Dot Network, for example, may have made some sort of economic sense, but they largely failed at the strategic level to demonstrate a clear US-led economic alternative to regionally based multilateral trade forums. RCEP, the CPTPP, the BRI, all indicate that demonstration of economic resolve within Asia will require a grand narrative, not necessarily that tactical level success. And while this may be going a little bit too far into the US domestic politics, we've already talked about this indeed, I think there will be a real challenge for the Biden administration to achieve that grand approach to multilateralism that's going to be necessary to show that narrative in the near to medium terms. Now, the fourth point that I'd make around strategy is that India's absence is notable, not just from an economic perspective, but from the perspective that India has the potential to act as a balancer against China's influence in Asia, which sits at the heart of the Indo-Pacific idea and indeed in new institutions like the D10. For all the talk of India's rise, it's clear that it remains a largely parochial power and that it lacks the domestic means to foster an international foreign or economic policy that can match what Western observers argue is that inherent potential. I'd just like to point out here that neither the Indo nor the Pacific economic centers of gravity are involved in Asia's predominant multilateral trade agreements, but that trade in Asia is now firmly centered on Northeast and Southeast Asia. So much for the non-military rationale around the Indo-Pacific. Fifth, RCEP's inception marks the creation of a regionally based economic institution that will have significant strategic impact on Asia's regional order to the degree that it was negotiated by Asian states to meet a particular Asian demand. This is an important point to make, as much Western-based strategy towards Asia is predicated on this idea around the need to preserve the liberal rules-based order. If you look at the various Indo-policy or Indo-Pacific strategies or concepts in Australia, in France, Germany, Japan, the Netherlands, or the United States, or even statements from the UK around the idea of replacing the G7 with the D10 to include Australia, Japan, and South Korea in this kind of consortium of democracies, this idea that's also really picking up steam under Biden. Order preservation is key to all of these engagements and these engagement types. Now, to date, these states have sought to ensure order through institutions like the Quad, which are predicated on military exchange and cooperation and dialogue, and have even floated ideas of things like intelligence sharing, joint operations, and military interoperability under a theoretical D10 security type agreement. What this suggests to me is that there's a fundamental misreading, not only coming from the West around the nature of Asia's changing order, but what are the appropriate means to deal with these changes? Now, the way that we see the challenge to the liberal-based order in a lot of these documents is that it's coming from Russian revisionism or Chinese revisionism or coercion, that it's under threat from these kind of top-down approaches. What we're actually seeing, though, and RCEP's a good example of this, is that the change to order isn't coming from this top-down approach. It's coming from integration between Asian states and even sub-state actors, which affect order kind of from the bottom up, more from the top down. Neither are Asian states preoccupied with these hard security issues, such as maritime security in the South China Sea, or even North Korean nuclearization, to the degree that a lot of Western states are, in particular the United States. They are rather focused on economic integration, not only as an ends in itself, but as a means to manage strategic tensions within the region between states, including with China. And this brings me to my last point, which is about the importance of RCEP to Canada. Now, while the economic benefits of engagement may be limited, and here I'll defer to my colleagues around the agreement specifics, there is a strategic benefit in the form of a regional commitment to multilateralism, particularly multilateralism that's as inclusive as RCEP. This is particularly the case if Canada opts for a strategic alignment with the Biden administration around its free and open Indo-Pacific approach, or what's shaping up, I think, within the Biden administration to be an extreme competition approach towards China that lacks kind of this coherent economic counterpart to its military engagement. You know, from my perspective, the importance of such engagement comes from the need to demonstrate diversification in approach, even diversification that includes some sort of engagement with China that further demonstrates independence of Canadian action and agency. And here I'll just revisit some of the debates from Western literature in particular about the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. So literature around Asian security today still, to this day, identifies those states that rejected AAIB engagement from US pressure as actors that didn't take advantage of certain opportunities within Asian multilateral engagement and integration. Now, this isn't to suggest that AIIB and RCEP are the same things, because I don't think the United States, at least to my knowledge, is pressuring anybody to stay out of RCEP or pressuring people not to participate. It's useful, though, to think about the AIIB era to see how early adoption around new regional institutions can provide a strategic net benefit, while hesitation around regionalism can lead to long-term reputational costs with respect to Asian economic and strategic engagement. So for Canada, demonstrating acceptance of and support for such regionalism, I think, will be essential to ensure it remains a welcome actor in the region, particularly one that's seen as pursuing its own national interests rather than in opposition to regional trends and developments. And with that, I'll conclude. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jeff. Another Vancouver participant, Yves Tiberghien, over to you.
Thank you, Diana. So I have the unfortunate job of closing the fascinating set of comments here. And I'll try to steer clear from several points with which I agree that were made either by Goto-san or Wendy or Jeff. So I'll just say first, it's a very big deal. And I should correct, the name of my book coming out in March is now The East Asian COVID-19 Paradox. And it's focused on how Asia's punched above its weight in dealing with COVID across the region, actually, and how we have seen an increase in regional integration during COVID, and in partly related to COVID. So it includes RCEP and other things. So RCEP is a big deal. In geoeconomic terms, I think that the two biggest events of 2020 were RCEP and the CAI between EU and China. It will have a big gravity effect for regional supply chains because of its single rule of origin certificate, which has very generous terms and actually has several options, right? The rules on value content are at 40%, very, very liberal level from anywhere in the region. But companies can also pick change in tariff heading options, which means, if you just turn a jam, this is a jam into a fruit into jam, you can already change the heading and you don't have to reach 40%. Or also processing rules for chemical and petrochemicals, even if you're below 40%. So that certificate offers companies the option to do all kinds of things within the region. There's also an ambitious service and investment chapter that was unexpected, more than expected in any way. And as mentioned, the first FTA between Japan, China, and Korea. Also the secretariat. So for anyone who studies regional integration, whether there is a secretariat or there is not, is a critical variable. The EU was created because there was a commission in the very first agreement, the Steel and Coal Community of 1950. And it was done on purpose by Jean Monnet. The secretariat becomes the entrepreneur that can think of, let's do new rules on this or that, right? And so it has this spillover impact. And I think Wendy mentioned that earlier. So the takeaway, the big takeaway at this level for the Biden administration is that the FOIP strategy needs an economic pillar. And Japan has always said that, by the way, but it cannot only drive on security measures. So then I have 4 more points. First, on the big picture and the meaning of RCEP. It's not the result of COVID. We know RCEP has been going on in negotiation for 8 years. And in fact, there were 11 ministerials, 4 leaders summits, and 29 negotiation meetings. So it's a long process. However, it's very interesting and noticeable that the closure happened smoothly and nicely with those pictures of the summit in Hanoi in the midst of the biggest pandemic, since the Great Flu of 1918, and in the midst of great security tensions between the US and China. That was stoked by COVID and of course by the US-China trade war. So it's quite interesting, and it's not totally unconnected. It is ASEAN-led. The region could not trust China or let China lead, and Japan cannot lead because of the China-Japan hiatus or tension. And it does consolidate all the previous FTA, but it generates momentum. And it generates, great support in the business community and the various ministries. The whole dynamic that leads to RCEP is actually very profound in each government. I had the chance of doing a bunch of interviews with the RCEP negotiators for Japan, both in MOFA and METI, December 2019, and other key players. And it was fascinating how much depth there was, right? There's a whole depth of thinking, of planning. There's a big team. And so whether there's a change of leadership or not, the structure of support within the government is very deep, and it's been here for a long time. And in a way, the way I see it as a strategic level, the global uncertainties created by the US-led trade war and the turn against many global institutions, the deglobalization trends, and COVID tensions on top of it have reinforced in the minds of Asian leaders the need for further building the institutional architecture. Uncertainty led to a greater need to finish RCEP. And uncertainty in Asia leads to the search for more order, more regularity, and that order and regularity has come in the form of RCEP because it was available. Second point, I'm going to add a few things on Japan from the meetings I had. So what's fascinating really is RCEP is the 4th leg of a very, very cleverly designed strategy that was put together in early 2017. It was put together with a team from METI and Gaimusho and supported by Prime Minister Abe. And it was made more urgent and more critical by the US departure from TPP. So that was the trigger point in the sense of panic that this created, as well as uncertainties about globalization and trade. I remember, for example, in 2018, landing in Tokyo and being taken to METI, and there was this new unit having to deal with how we deal with inequality. We have to find solutions for inequality in American society, otherwise the trading system will collapse. So suddenly they had to care about American inequality. So there was all this sense of panic. And they did this very systematic work. The first leg in their planning was always finishing the TPP. And the critical point here was in February, I think February 11, 2017, Abe traveled to meet with President Trump, and the whole team was there, METI, MOFA, and they wanted to make sure that Trump will okay a move to TPP 11. Of course, Trump did not have Lighthizer on his side at the time, so did not understand the competitive dynamics of trade agreements. And he said, yes, yeah, who cares about TPP? It's a stupid agreement. Do what you want with it. So basically, this is at that meeting that Japan got the agreement to go ahead, got cover. And so the CPTPP became the #1 point in the strategy for Japan. #2 was finishing the EU-Japan strategic partnership, and it was accelerated at the same time. #3 was neutralizing potential trade war with the US, and so getting to that US agreement. And by the way, Japan made sure that it would not be imposed what Canada or Mexico have received in the USMCA, the 3210 article, which was an article preventing Canada and Mexico from any trade deal with China. I had that discussion in Japan, and I said, there's no way we would accept anything like this because we knew RCEP would come, and we cannot agree to lose RCEP that way. So Japan did not have to carry that poison pill, right, against any deal with China. And then the fourth leg of the plan was RCEP. This was part of a quadrilateral strategy that was designed in a very organized way, and had a big team supporting it in several ministries. And so it's been always seen as critical for the future of the Japanese trade and economy. We have to remember that Japan exports 25% of its goods to China, if we include Hong Kong. And Asia is rising, China is rising. And so there is no way that Japan can guarantee its prosperity or its growth without exports to China and the rest of the region. And that has to be therefore stabilized, regularized, institutionalized to avoid uncertainties. RCEP became the critical tool to get more stability in the relationship with China. And there are several key elements that were brought by Japan here, including rules on e-commerce, like data localization and other things. So it was always seen as critical for the Japanese team. Japan, of course, wanted India on board, and this was a bit of a big shock when India pulled out in 2019. But Japan was not going to pull out, even in 2019. I had this dinner right afterwards with the Japanese negotiator, and yes, there was a play, on we will pull out with India, but it was not. It was bluffing, essentially. About India, Arvind Subramanian recently has said there were really three factors. The first one is the inward turn of India, as Wendy has said. The second one was the Indian-ASEAN deal being assessed as not very good. And then finally, the China factor. So I won't say more. Finally, I've done a bit of a survey of how RCEP was portrayed across the region by studying the editorials in the newspapers in all 15 countries. And it's pretty fascinating that the big takeaway is that this is focused on saving the global order from chaos, right? From uncertainties, including US-led uncertainties. So it's about multilateralism primarily. For example, in Australia, it's about common standards and also getting beyond what we get in a bilateral agreement with China to tie China to more standards. Cambodia was multilateralism. China was a victory for multilateralism. Indonesia was about economic advantages, a boost to competitiveness for Indonesia, and more trade with China. For Japan was a boost for Asia trade and investment, removal of tariffs from China, and incentive for Biden to rejoin the TPP and the WTO dispute settlement. So there's a clear hope that on the Japanese side that this is a further incentive for the US to come back. Malaysia, it was about stability of investment climate in Asia. New Zealand, it was about creating a good economic environment beyond the COVID crisis, how to recover from COVID. New Zealand is hit about 6% this year in economic terms. Philippines was about boosting trade and investment and digital transformation, an engine for economic progress. Singapore looked more at new trade and investment openness in Asia and deepened the connectivity between Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia. So this is the strategic view from Singapore, very interesting. In South Korea, it was about rebuilding multilateralism and overcome the protectionism in the context of the US-South Korea trade conflict and other tensions. In Thailand, it was overcoming the uncertainty of the pandemic and trade tensions led by the US and stabilize supply chains with China. In Vietnam was more investment attractions for Vietnam, very focused. Vietnam is very clear and pragmatic. And in conclusion, it's also important to see that RCEP played an incentive role, a competitive role in accelerating the EU-China agreement. I had the chance to talk with some high-level people on the EU side, and clearly, initially the EU, by the way, walked away on December 15. They had put very clear requirements for what they wanted. China came back, December 22 with offers on all those requirements. But the EU in its justification memos and explanation cited RCEP as one factor. They said, well, the US has a trade one at the first trade deal with China, phase one, and Asia has RCEP. We cannot fall behind. We have to do something, and we have to accelerate on our own. So there is clearly a dynamic created by RCEP, but above all, it's fascinating to see that it's partly a side effect from the trade war and from also COVID uncertainties that accelerated or the push and the unanimity for RCEP in Asia. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Eve, and thank you, everybody. That was fascinating. I'm going to take my prerogative as moderator here to throw a couple of questions based on what you've been talking about. So I think we all agree that RCEP as a trade agreement per se is probably pretty weak, but in fact, its impact is much greater for a number of reasons that you have outlined. I'm particularly interested in the idea of, since the US is for many countries no longer the principal trade partner, that it's turning to China. That's one aspect. But the whole question of momentum, does our RCEP does have momentum? Is it going to evolve? The other thing I'm interested in is particularly in Northeast Asia, where you have an agreement among the top 3 economies for the first time. What kind of impact is that going to have? So I'm going to just throw those out and see if anybody want to take any of those on? Don't be shy. Mike, go ahead.
Just on how weak the RCEP agreement is, I agree with your earlier comments, but I can't really imagine that RCEP would have gone through if it had been much more comprehensive in that sense. And if you think about originally, we haven't talked about this, about the Yokohama vision of in 2010, to think about, okay, what are we going to be doing in the Asia Pacific region in 10 years? What should it be? And the idea was there would be 2 tracks that would eventually meet in what would be called a free trade area of the Asia Pacific. One track would be the TPP track. The TPP had already started its negotiations, so that was clear. And then there would be an Asian track, which would not go as quickly or as deep because it couldn't, but it would sort of be a good, if you will, in-between place to sort of help countries that need to put in new frameworks, develop them as they move along the path. And then eventually, obviously it's not 2020, eventually you come together. And I think this could be very important because when you go through the RCEP agreement, there are a lot of obviously flexibilities very frequently for they don't name them the least developed countries in the region. And I think that even though it seems weak, that they are going to have to begin to make changes in order to accommodate what the requirements are going to be for RCEP. But, as Wendy said, when you look at the agreement, it does not look very tight, but that's very typical of any ASEAN-led agreement. If you look in the old days of ASEAN, I mean, there were never any controversies because the point wasn't about economics, it was about politics. I don't think we should take this sort of, I think in the back of our minds, we always have an EU or a NAFTA way of kind of looking at things that is very rigorous on the rules side. I think with a Asian agreement of this type, we should expect it to be fairly weak to start off. But as Wendy said, and I agree with her 100%, it's going to be a living agreement and it's going to change over time. It'll become tighter as it goes along. So I'm relatively, optimistic in that. I think that evolution is going to be interesting to see. Also, we see these ASEAN agreements have a tendency to increase over time, to get more members. And we already see that, I believe there's an 18-month moratorium for everyone except for India. India can join any time. But I think the next economy is going to be Hong Kong will be on, and I think it's going to pull in. I think that eventually India will come around, but that's my own view.
Anybody else want to jump in here? Come on, Wendy, you have a comment, I know.
Well, maybe I can build on what Michael just said, that not only is it's a living agreement in terms of like strengthening the rules and chapters that are already addressed, but I think there'll also be a venue and a forum for addressing new challenges and emerging issues. And that to me is going to be like a key loss for the US not being at the table. Because when 15 trade ministers from these countries get together, that's a pretty formidable group of ministers. And I would just add there just one dynamic that when the US now goes to, and the US will be showing up under the Biden administration to these summits in Asia, but I can only imagine there'll be these side meetings of the RCEP ministers and the US won't be there. And I remember when I was member of in the government, in the TPP delegation, we used to have these TPP meetings on the side of APEC or other meetings where the countries that weren't part of that club, you kind of feel like, you're on the outside, you haven't been invited in, you haven't paid the dues. And so that's a very uncomfortable feeling. But I do want to put on the table, because I think people have been pretty pessimistic on this panel of where the Biden administration is going with respect to economic engagement in the Asia Pacific. I think it's too early to say, to write this off. Clearly, I don't see the Biden administration anytime soon joining CPTPP. And if they were to consider it, in mid, let's just say mid first term or second term, they would need to seek significant revisions and updates. But I don't think that CPTPP is the only alternative. The Biden has brought in, and it's already been referred to, kind of a first-rate team of experienced folks who know Asia, understand diplomacy, and understand the need for us to be involved, to be engaged economically in Asia. So let's give them some space to kind of figure out how they're going to shape that engagement. I mean, in my view, it should be kind of as a starting point, it could be a combination of showing up at these meetings, being very active in APEC this year, particularly under the leadership of New Zealand, where climate change in particular has been put as one of the key issues, along with digital trade. And then perhaps pursuing some kind of one issue, narrow sectoral agreements, whether on digital trade or medical supply chains or climate and trade, but take that first step in, work together, try and bring together a group of countries to shape such a deal and build momentum and rebuild trust through that. So again, I think we need, I don't want the panel, the consensus to be that the US, we already lost out. I'm pretty hopeful, and I think we're smart enough and creative enough, and we've got incredible people leading our government now, that I think we'll find a way back into Asia. And it may not be the traditional way or the way that many of us on the panel hope for, but I think there's a lot of opportunity.
Thanks very much. I have some questions from our audience here, so I'm going to mention some of those here. And there's one actually that was part of my next question, which was about how countries are going to steer their way against the backdrop of the US-China dispute. How are countries going to be able, particularly, I'm thinking about Japan. You talked about Japan no longer being a caretaker, but more of a leader, but other countries as well, steering in between those. How and further integration, how is that going to happen? And otherwise, China is important in all of this, of course, but when you look at other countries in the region who are also part of supply chains, will this trade war have an impact in terms of how supply chains are going to be developing? So does anybody have any comments on those?
I can take a stab at how the small middle power Asian states are going to navigate the US-China relations. I think one of the things that we're seeing is the emergence of ASEAN as a strategic center of gravity in the Asia Pacific. And certainly that's nothing new, but it does seem to have gathered pace under the Trump administration in particular, when competition became kind of the defining characteristic between the US and China, and the region was being pulled in different directions with respect to having to make some hard choices about which direction they'd like to kind of strategically direct themselves. I think the ASEAN Indo-Pacific outlook is a good place to start thinking about how those ASEAN member states think about competition in the region. One of the things that that particular outlook was very clear about is the need to avoid the the perception of great power politics within Southeast Asia, the need to maintain a degree of neutrality within the institution and among the member states themselves as they approach the United States. I think that you have states like Indonesia coming out and talking about the need to have strategic equidistance between different powers. Again, this is nothing that's particularly new, but it has seemed to become a defining feature of the way that the region is defining itself and basically defining the problem of great power cooperation. We've seen, I think, excellent speeches coming from the Prime Minister of Singapore around the need for Asia to maintain a degree of neutrality between the two powers. I think that will become a defining characteristic of most of the middle and small powers' foreign policy and security policy approaches going forward. And hopefully, I think that will become a defining feature of the region, is just that need to manage between, different strategic approaches to the great powers, but to try to be a stabilizing force within that competition by clearly defining a middle ground within the region around institutions, around Southeast Asia in particular, and around multilateralism is going to be a key part of that.
Thanks, Jeff. Anybody else want to jump in on that? If not, Eve, go ahead.
Right. So I think it points to the bigger strategic question, also for the U.S. in dealing with China, and it deals with both actually the Asia region and the European partners. So the Biden administration right now is trying to pitch three big things, right? Three big goals at the same time. And I think the lesson will be that it will require some adjustments to be able to pursue them. The three are not fully compatible. So one is this extreme competition with China, as termed by the President Biden. Second is work with allies and rebuild alliances. So in this case, it's Japan, Korea, Australia, etc. And then third is more global multilateralism to deal with things like climate and pandemic and the like. But what comes out of the Asia, but also from European partners, is that they don't want to focus on the power transition, this great hegemonic transition and all this, which really agitates Washington. They accept in a way that there is a power transition, right? 20% of GDP has shifted hand in 20 years. This is unavoidable. What they want to focus on is global rules, global institutions, and then regional rules and institutions to really tie down China into this, this mesh of rules. That's what the bet they want, right? Rather than destroy institutions or break rules, which was the approach followed by the Trump administration. And so eventually there will be, all those discussions between the US and the allies. So the ideal point would be a convergence on targeted security action, security moves that in a way prevent against security dangers. They have to be in a lean, competent, targeted way and effective. And on the other hand, work on global and regional institutions that include the US. That's the desire, right? And therefore, they want to shift away from a focus on stopping the rise of China, decoupling, Cold War. Those things don't have support from the allies, either in Europe or Asia.
Thanks, thank you. Oh, Shihoko-san, I have a question here that I thought would be addressed to you, which is, what about the relationship between Japan and Korea? So if you could add that on to your, whatever it is that you were going to be commenting on. Thank you.
All right, so actually 3 points then. The last one will be about Japan and Korea, but my first point I wanted to make was that unlike TPP, where the end goal from a US perspective in particular was as much a political system to integrate countries, RCEP is clearly a decoupling of economic interests from security interests. We are not expecting countries to be more dependent on China or have stronger security relations as a result of RCEP. So there is this clear separation of trade frameworks from the security front. Another point I did want to make is that Japan even though it has integrated more fully with China as a result of RCEP, at the same time, during the pandemic, it's been able to accelerate what it has been trying to achieve for quite a few years, which is to say, to relocate from China. So there has been this incentivization by the Japanese government, giving around $2 billion for companies to either relocate back to Japan from China or to move away from China to somewhere outside of China, mainly to Southeast Asia. RCEP has certainly made that easier, but what is interesting is that there hasn't really been much pushback from the Chinese government on this. Certainly there hasn't been any market punitive action by Beijing for Japan to take this action. On the Japan-Korea issue, again, for the United States, closer relations between Japan and Korea are critical for not just for economic reasons, but for security purposes in ensuring the alliance both between the United States and Japan and the United States and Korea. Many had hoped that Japan and Korea working in this multilateral trade framework would give them an opportunity to cease fire, to back down from some of the harsh rhetoric and policies that each have taken. But that actually hasn't happened, and there will probably be this continuation of decoupling of economic from security interests, from diplomatic relations to economic interests between Japan and Korea.
Thanks very much. I have another question on India. What is the relationship in terms of if India were to try to rejoin, or would it participate as an observer, or do you think that RCEP will be changed by having India involved? And then the follow-on to that, of course, would be, what about other potential? Hong Kong, of course, was mentioned, but do you think that RCEP will evolve as an agreement itself in terms of how it accommodates other members? Anybody want to jump in on that one?
I can start on that one. So I think Michael touched upon it, that first of all, the RCEP deal is not in effect yet, right? So they have a ratification. Countries now are going through their domestic ratification, and for it to come into effect, my understanding is that at least 6 of the ASEAN partners need to ratify it, and 3 of the dialogue partners. So let's say optimistically it comes into effect the first quarter of 2022. Then my understanding is for the next 18, the door is not open for new members for then 18 months from that, with the exception of India. Now, countries really wanted to bring India into this deal, and my understanding is in like the last throes of the negotiation that Japan and others really tried to push India hard bilaterally to join. But also as a group, they did offer India, a number of exceptions. They discussed having a special safeguard and other provisions to make it easier for India. But they didn't succeed. And so what they agreed to is that India now can be an observer in all of the meetings, and the door is open for India, right away. It doesn't have to wait for those 18 months after ratification. I mean, the question is this, I think what the question really means, is it going to even become more difficult for India to join if this agreement is strengthened and expanded to new areas? I mean, clearly that's one, real possibility. But, my view is that if India really had the political will and wanted to join, that probably the RCEP countries would find ways to give them long transitions or, other footnotes or other exceptions that would make it easier. I mean, I think the frustration is, and I'm, throughout my career, having negotiated with India on many occasions, and, had a lot of close colleagues who did, India is very difficult on the trade front. They're not interested in trade liberalization. And so, from tariffs to non-tariff barriers, they're very reluctant to relax those barriers and eliminate them. I think it's telling that under the Trump administration, the US was very close for a number of years with a mini trade deal with India. And that couldn't even been, they failed to take that over the finish line. So I would not underestimate how difficult it will be to bring India into RCEP. I think we'd have to see kind of a new political and economic view of India about its place in the world. And again, as I mentioned earlier, there is a lot of domestic opposition to trade liberalization in India. And you only have to look at what's going on now with the farmers, surrounding Delhi to get a sense of how much opposition they were facing and would have faced if they entered into this deal.
Mike, you wanted to jump in there as well?
Just very briefly, I think Wendy hit on all the major points, but I did do quite a bit of research on India and talked to a lot of Indians about the perceptions, and Wendy's 100% correct, but it's not just the trade liberalization part in general, which is true. It's about China. Was mentioned earlier about the bilateral balance. Also a great fear that with structural adjustment in China, that the excess supply of cheap manufacturers were going to go and flood the Indian market, and this would lead to great job disruption. And then also remember the military skirmish, which is still very much on the minds of Indians. So this is like lose-lose in every way. And I've talked to the private sector, and they're saying we're crazy to step out of the RCEP, but the politics are just really overwhelming. And this is a very distinguished group here, but I don't know of any. I know a lot of free trade areas that make no sense economically, but make sense politically. I don't know of any that make sense economically, but do not make sense politically. And so I think, it's going to be very difficult to move that forward.
Thanks very much. We have time for one more question, and that has to do, well, it's a two-parter. One is Japan-China. Does RCEP open up an opportunity? Do you think Japan's going to take advantage of it? And secondly, ASEAN. RCEP is an ASEAN baby to a great extent. How do you think this is going to impact ASEAN going forward? Eve, you have to jump in on this one.
I can say a few words. I mean, actually, also echoing what Goto-san said on this relocation reshoring deal, right? It was just $2 billion to reshore to Japan and $200 million to move to ASEAN, right? So not a big package, but that was last May. Well, the Nikkei newspaper just had a pretty big study last week on Thursday on supply chains between Japan and China, and the big story was nobody's leaving China. There's only 7% of the firm that have indicated they will downscale in China. And indeed, you had interviews of people like Komatsu and others saying we're doubling down because it's booming. And it's the only place that's booming now. So there is, so if anything, RCEP is one more step in this. No, but I would agree, just as Mike said about the India-China, if there was, the whole region is still vulnerable to security clashes. So if there was a crisis around Taiwan or South China Sea, all this would become volatile. So there is always that big shadow over there. And those are open wounds. Taiwan is always an open wound because it's highly, highly sensitive. And there is a lack of stabilizers on the China side. There's certain things that would trigger an escalation. Trump administration was playing with those triggers, and so we were close to something worse, right? Kevin Rudd, Wendy knows as well, was talking of the guns of August and the risk of a crisis that could degenerate in August because of Taiwan. So there is that. But at the moment, I think also there had been good strategic meeting between Kedan then and Prime Minister Abe, discussing what to do with China and how to reduce the exposure. And the response by Kedan then to Abe was, we can't decouple. There is no pathway to growth and trade that makes sense for Japan without China. However, you do see a decoupling of supply chain. So, I mean, or bifurcation of supply chain. There is a few companies that are moving out, and instead of growing their supply chains in South Asia and India for a China cleans, supply chain that can export to the US. So they're aware of that trade war. It's more trade war driven, but there have been some moves, to Vietnam and South Asia dealing with, with the US. So many companies are still building the supply chain in China for the China market and for the secondary market into ASEAN through China, but they're also creating a secondary supply network, for the US.
Thanks very much. So any final comments from anyone on anything that we've mentioned so far?
Could I just mention one thing? I think there's a complication that's emerged that is going to be a conundrum when we have, in the case of ASEAN, is that no one has talked about what's going on in Myanmar right now. And this is, it's not clear to me how ASEAN is going to deal with this. I could see how it's going to work out in the body politic in Australia, and that's going to lead to some complications in the ratification process, I'll bet.
That's a very good point. Anybody else?
I would just add, I think there are going to be complications among other countries, right? Whenever you have 15 countries that are part of a deal and they all have to ratify and they all have relations with each other, you can only imagine how the legislatures in certain of these countries are going to be scrutinizing this deal. Australia comes to mind, given the growing, let's just say, the growing tensions with China. The notion of entering into another economic deal with China, if you're sitting in Canberra after, your FTA basically has been cast aside as import restrictions have been imposed. So I think we may see, some interesting ratification efforts in different RCEP countries. That said, not all 15 of them have to ratify again for it to come into effect.
That's absolutely correct. Anybody else? Final comments? If not, I'm going to thank you all very much for participating. Thank you very much to the panelists. And thank you very much to the Center for the Study of Global Japan. Please keep your eyes open for upcoming events. And thank you very much to our audience. This will be recorded and available on the website shortly. Good to see you all. And Happy New Year of the Ox. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.